Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to share with you the analysis of a very exciting and famous game played in a World Championship match between Boris Spassky and Tigran Petrosian back in 1966. And this is how the game started. d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, and bishop g5. This variation is a reasonable alternative to the main lines of the Queen's Gambit or Queen's Indian defense that typically would arise after white playing c2 to c4. Black here, of course, has numerous options, among them to play h6 immediately, or playing b6, not closing the center with d5, as Black did, or even playing c5. In this game, Petrosian chose to play d5, kind of a la Queen's Gambit. Came knight b2 d2, developing, bishop e7, e3, knight b2 d7, and bishop to d3. Very natural and common developing moves on both sides. c5, and now a very common move, almost like an automatic move, c3. Otherwise, Black would be able to push the c-pawn further and chase away White's light-squared bishop from that diagonal where it is ideally positioned. That's why White typically responds with c3, so anytime Black plays c4, the bishop could retreat to c2 instead of e2. And Black continued with b6. You may notice that Black is delaying castling, and they do it for a purpose, namely to keep the option open to possibly castle to the queen side. White castled, and Black played bishop b7. Of course, White could have various plans in this position, among them playing a4 with the idea of a5, or playing queen e2 with ideas of possibly playing e3, e4. But one of the main ideas also in this opening is to try to play knight e5, with the plan of creating a Pillsbury attack that typically is associated with playing f4 and then bringing the queen out to f3 and h3, and especially once the Black king castles to the king side, those type of attacks can be pretty dangerous. However, in this position, Black can play more ambitiously than just castling and allowing White's plan. And in fact, Petrosian in this position traded knights immediately and followed it up by knight d7. If Black instead could come to e4, it wouldn't be a bad idea. The problem is that tactically it has some shortcomings, namely the fact that White will have the opportunity to play bishop to b5, forcing the Black king to move and therefore give up the right to castle. Therefore, knight fd7 is pretty much a must. And this is the first moment of the game where White made a mistake. The correct move in this position is to trade bishops on e7, and after the queen recapture, play f4. Now you may think for a moment that White's double pawns on the e-file may mean that White is in an inferior position. However, that certainly is not the case, as the e5 pawn is a pretty effective one in restricting the mobility of the Black pieces. In fact, for that reason, Black in most games in this position tries to play f6 to immediately get rid of that annoying pawn there on e5. Of course, the cost is if White trades those pawns, White no longer will have doubled pawns, and therefore White would be straightening out his own pawn structure. Practice has shown that white's best bet right now is to give the check, using the moment that black is unable to block the check with the pawn on the g file, because then bishop would capture on g6 immediately. And black always plays queen f7 in this position. And then white retreats to e2. You can notice that white kind of purposefully lost the tempo with the queen, not going to e2 right away, but first giving the check on h5, and then when the black queen moved onto the f file into the fire of the white rook, only then retreat to e2. So now, for example, if black would capture on e5 after the white pawn recaptures, it would be an immediate discovery attacking the black queen, just like this. Black usually castles at this point to the queen side, and now white has a slightly better position, either by playing e4 right away, and then, for example, f takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, and white's e-pawn is more of an asset than a weakness. Or the other option is to not play e4 right away, but trade on f6 first, and then to play e4. Let's go back to our game where Boris Spassky made a mistake by keeping the dark squared bishops on the board. Bishop retreated to f4 with the idea to protect the e5 pawn. And if black now would castle and play kind of that natural way, then white indeed would have an attractive position, because the white queen could come out to the king side by queen h5 or queen g4 and develop threats to the black king. But black had totally different plans. Played queen c7, immediately going after white's e5 pawn. White protected it. And now it's quite remarkable the plan that black came up with, namely playing h6, preparing g5. White played bishop g3, and g5 arrived anyway. You may be surprised that the black king has not castled yet to either side. However, with the center being as closed as it is, the black king is by no means in any danger. Of course, after black's last move, black kind of made it clear that he does not intend to castle to the king's side, but to the other side of the board. Knowing that, white immediately played b4, signaling the attack on that side of the board. Indeed, if black right now would capture and try to win a pawn, then white would get excellent compensation by playing knight d4 with ideas of knight b5 and rook c1 and queen h5, depending on how black continues. But one thing is clear, once the c-file is open, that the black king will not find complete safety on either side of the board at this point. So therefore, Petrosian wisely refused to accept this pawn sacrifice, and rather continued with h5. Another excellent move, threatening to trap white's bishop. White responded with h4. Black captured, and the bishop remained on the diagonal to protect the e5 pawn. And now black was ready to castle to the queen side. Right now, white's best choice was to trade pawns on c5, to at least somewhat open files on the queen side where black's king is. Instead, white played a very natural move, but which turned out to be a mistake. a4. It's a natural thought to try to push up the pawns on the side where our opponent's king is. The problem is that black has a very smart solution here to the problem, and no longer will allow the opening of the files against the black king. Black played c4. That's it. The queen side has been closed. Bishop e2, and now a very smart move. Although the immediate h3 also comes into consideration, a6 is a very wise move, because now at any time in the future white would try to open the position with b5, black's reaction will be a5, and still both a and b files are completely closed. Or if white would try to play a5, then black would play b5, and again the queen side remains locked up. The game continued with white playing king to h1, moving out from the future attack of black on the g file. Nevertheless, the black rook still comes there. White played rook g1, protecting on g2, and rook g4. Black is ready to double the rooks. Queen d2 and rook h to g8. And white intended to open the file, but naturally Petrosian keeps it closed. In addition to the pressure on the g file, another plan that black can have in this position is to target white's e5 pawn. And how? Bringing an additional piece to attack it, possibly bishop f8 and g7. White played rook a to d1 and came bishop to f8. And now white must do something, because if black gets the time, the bishop will get to g7 and then indeed capture that pawn on e5. And now comes the exciting part of the game. White played knight h2 in hopes to chase away the white rook, and if it moves away, then bishop takes pawn on h5. And here comes the genius of Petrosian and the pattern that he was so famous for, namely the intuitive, positional, long-term exchange sacrifice. He simply ignored the threat to the rook and captured the pawn on e5 immediately. Even though the knight has stepped onto a pin, it is clear that white cannot attack it with another pawn, and if he attacks it with another piece, black can always play bishop d6 if nothing else and keep the knight safe. White immediately captured the rook on g4, and the plan was to capture back with a pawn. Right now, black has 2 pawns for the exchange, which of course in itself is typically enough compensation, but a lot more importantly, black has a very significant attack. The one thing that black needs to improve on is the activity of his bishop on b7. And indeed, if that bishop would get revived, that is, if the d5 pawn wouldn't be there, that bishop could be a very valuable asset for black's attack. And in reality, white constantly needs to look out for black trying to get rid of that pawn by advancing it to d4 and trying to combine it with a discovery attack. White played a tricky move by playing e4. The pawn is taboo because after pawn takes pawn, bishop takes, the queen cannot recapture because of the immediate checkmate on d8. Obviously, Petrosian didn't fall for that and played bishop d6, a very important move to unpin that knight on e5. Right now, if white trades on d5, in addition to the simple bishop recapture, black has a tricky move, knight d3. And if now bishop takes d6, knight takes f2, and white gets checkmated after g3. Let's go back. After bishop d6, white played queen to e3. And now black followed with knight d7, offering the exchange of bishops, which white accepted. And here white made a big mistake by playing rook to d4. It has been suggested for white to instead play f4, but even then black has the advantage after en passant and then trading rooks, trading pawns, and playing f5. Black would have still a strong attack, but f4 certainly would have been a lot better move than the game move rook d4. And now this is the favorite part of the game, where black moves all his pawns. A whole phalanx of pawns gets moving forward. e5, chasing the rook back, and now the only pawn that hasn't moved yet, f5. Look at that. Now black is ready to open files and diagonals for his pieces. For example, if pawn takes, then h3. And the g-pawn cannot move too well because discovery comes, although the white queen is still protected because of the pin, but black would play queen f6 and then queen h4 with a devastating attack. After f5, the game continued with white capturing rather on d5, f4, queen e4, and knight f6. An amazing attack. Check, king b8, f3, bishop c8, queen b1, and g3. Here black has already numerous ways to win, but the chosen one is quite effective as well. h3. If pawn would take right now, black would respond with g2 check, king g1, and then getting the most effective attacking piece, the queen, over there quickly with queen d7, threatening from two directions, on one hand on a7 and on the other hand by getting to h3. In the game, white did not capture on h3, but played bishop to f1, rook h8, pawn takes, bishop takes, the king is trying to run, and here black could play the simple knight d5 with a big advantage, but black played the fancier e4 with the idea that if pawn takes, then f3, followed by checkmate in the corner. White instead responded with queen to d1, and now the simple queen d7 would do it, but black played a fancier knight g4. Look at that move, with all kinds of threats. Pawn took, f3, now we see the back rank checkmate threat. White played rook g2, pawn took, and white did not want to suffer any further. A very nice game by the late world champion Tigran Petrosian. And now let's see the jewel of the week. In this position, black seems to have humongous material advantage, and they do. And yet, white can save the game. I suggest you take your time, lean back and try to figure out what the solution is. Then come back and compare your solution with the actual one. And here comes the solution. White plays knight c6. Black now has to be careful where to go with the king. If it goes to c8, obviously it would step immediately into a fork. If the king would go to the corner instead, then after rook d7, black would have unsolvable problems with the checkmate threat on a7. After knight c6, black better goes to the 7th rank. Did white run out of checks? Not quite. Rook d7. Again, if king takes, then fork with knight e5, and the knight will catch the g-pawn just on time. King b6. But how can white save the game now? White ran out of checks, black's material advantage is still there. And amazingly, white is saving the game. Knight b4, threatening to checkmate. But black can easily protect that, which is true. And still the white knight moves to d5. Bishop takes. And now, the jewel of the week, rook d6, ending the game with an elegant stalemate. I hope you enjoyed this endgame as I did, as well as our instructional games, Spassky Petrosian. Thank you for listening, and be back next week. Bye-bye.